Welcome back to Board Game Wednesdays. Today we're going over the 6th and 7th round of our playthrough of Axis and Allies 1942 2nd Edition. Last time, the German Baltic Fleet was sunk. The Soviets retook Karelia, and the Americans are closing in on what's left of the German Africa Corps. On all fronts, the Allies are squeezing in, closing in on Berlin. Can the Japanese break the stranglehold and make an effective push on Moscow? Only one way to find out.
Spring 1944. The fate of the board hangs in the balance as the game enters its 6th round. The Western Allies occupy territories bordering Germany, while a Japanese army builds up outside of Moscow. This is where we begin round 6, with the Soviets repairing their bombed factory, then building infantry and artillery to defend the motherland. Despite the threat posed by the Japanese, the Red Army only has the strength to attack the Germans in Ukraine. The Soviets will destroy this army, ending any foreseeable threat from the Germans, then turn around and push back the Japanese. The Soviets descended on the Germans with everything that could reach them. The first roll was devastating for both sides. In the second roll, however, not a single German unit landed a hit. The Soviets pressed the attack, taking no further casualties and reoccupying the territory. What had initially looked like a potential stalemate turned into a resounding success for the Red Army. Those 5 tanks would be invaluable to future operations in both East and West. In the non-combat phase, the Soviets concentrated all their remaining forces in Russia, deploying their entire build there as well. They were not worried about leaving the Caucasus undefended, as the British would block the Japanese from blitzing, as well as reinforce the defenses in Moscow. If taken, the Axis could end what was shaping up to be an Allied victory. The Soviet players now had one directive: Moscow must not fall. The Japanese would have to deal with the Soviets all on their own. The Germans had exhausted their offensive capabilities in the east and were shifting their attention to the Western Front. With the Allies knocking on Berlin's door, the Germans intended to reoccupy Western Europe. However, with both their factories facing the threat of amphibious assault, the Germans couldn't mobilize an overwhelming force, just enough to push back the front lines while keeping Germany and Italy safe. Back and forth fighting in Western Europe was fine, as long as it kept the Allies tied up and out of Japan's hair. The Germans built a handful of infantry and artillery, then moved 2 medium-sized armies into northwestern Europe and France. They briefly considered occupying Karelia, but axed the plan. 2 IPCs was not worth losing a tank. Rather than bomb the Caucasus again, the Germans sent their bomber against the unguarded British transport. An unfortunate blunder by the UK team, but one the Germans would gladly take full advantage of. In Africa, the remaining tank invaded South Africa and the Belgian Congo, ready for its last stand against the Americans. As expected, the Germans retook Western Europe, weakly holding the 2 territories. Still, the Allies' next offensive would most likely be there, rather than Italy or Germany. The aircraft returned to their launch points, and the Germans deployed their build, collecting 35 IPCs. The Germans would force the Western Allies to devote even more resources to fighting them, until the Japanese succeeded in the east or until Berlin fell. The British players could not believe they had forgotten to take the bomber into account when building and placing their transport. Suddenly, the UK's offensive capabilities had been significantly weakened. While this was annoying, it was far from a death sentence. They would rebuild in time, and with the Americans preparing to land in Europe, the Germans were merely delaying the inevitable. In the meantime, the British would play the war of attrition game with Germany, building more invasion forces for the UK and just 1 tank for India. And infantry from Finland joined the forces from the UK in attacking France. The British sustained only 1 casualty in the invasion. Each non-combat move saw British forces moving into Soviet territory. The forces in Finland took up the defense of Karelia, artillery in Persia blocked Japanese blitzes in Kazakh SSR, and the British tank moved to aid the defense of Russia. The British would continue to hold fast against the Japanese, waiting for the right opportunity to go on the offensive. The British deployed their build and collected 33 IPCs, 34 with the one they saved, still stuck in the 30s range they'd been all game. The destruction of the German Africa Corps couldn't come soon enough. With Germany no longer a factor in the Soviet theater, the time for a Japanese offensive was now. They prepared to hit Russia with everything they had, but strong Allied defenses plus nearby Soviet reserves gave the Japanese players pause. Would they be strong enough to take and hold Moscow? The players turned to an Axis and Allies battle calculator to help answer the question. After tallying up the strength of each force, the calculator revealed the defenders had a 98.3% chance at victory. Obviously, this immediately ended the planned attack on Russia. The Japanese looked at seizing Kazakh SSR instead, but Soviet counterattacks had a 96.6% chance of wiping them out. The Japanese drew up a new plan. They would continue to hold and reinforce Novosibirsk, waiting for an attack on India. Once India was taken, the army in Novosibirsk would link up with the Southern Attack Force, pushing into the Caucasus and Moscow. It was a risky plan, especially with the American Pacific presence building up, but it was all they had. The Japanese built forces for Manchuria, Japan, and Sea-Zone 62, then reinforced their positions. Collecting 40 IPCs, they planned to strike India in 2 turns. The United States, however, looked to throw a wrench into that plan. The majority of their units were still built for the European front, but in the Pacific, the US Navy entered the IJN striking range, attacking New Guinea. The invasion had 2 main objectives. First, occupy the island and reduce Japanese IPC count. But second, the US Navy wanted to draw the IJN into a fight. The in-range naval forces were at similar strength, and even with additional Japanese fighters from Sea-Zone 62, any fight would prove costly for the IJN. While the US Navy would suffer too, the American players felt it was worth the risk to potentially cripple the IJN, especially with their new Pacific Fleet being built up. Plus, if the IJN did not attack, the American fleet could assault the Philippines or the Money Islands next turn, accomplishing similar goals. It was a risky plan, but with the Allies' commanding position over the board, it was one they were willing to take. Back west, the bomber would continue its campaign over Germany. The tanks in Africa would recapture Italian East Africa and Rhodesia, and the forces in French Equatorial Africa would finally assault the last of the German Africa Corps. The tank did put up a fight, taking out 2 infantry, but was ultimately destroyed. By the end of the next round, the German presence in Africa would be wiped away. In Germany itself, the bomber dealt a whopping 6 IPCs worth of damage, and in the South Pacific, the Americans lost in infantry taking New Guinea. The Americans moved more reinforcements into Morocco and deployed their build, collecting 42 IPCs. All American eyes were on the Kriegsmarine going into their next turn. Returning to the Soviets to start off round 7, the Red Army would only reinforce itself this turn. Along with forces built to defend against the Japanese, the Soviets built 2 tanks for the factory in Karelia. Once Germany was properly surrounded, the Allied players had discussed a 3-pronged attack. Starting with the British and followed by the Americans, the Soviets would push into Germany with a medium-sized force, destroying the weakened defenders before they had time to reinforce, and knocking Germany out of the game. The tanks bound for Karelia would be the start of this invasion force. Only the tanks would move this turn, splitting up across the 3 main Soviet territories. Deploying their build, the Soviets collected 25 IPCs, higher than their original starting amount. The Red Army was revving back up. In the west, Germany attacked France again. Repairing their factory and building more infantry and artillery, the Germans struck the British with a small yet superior force, providing air support from Germany proper. The bomber would resume its attacks on the Caucasus factory. Unsurprisingly, the Germans took back France, weakly holding on to it. The bomber, however, was shot down by Soviet flak. Looking to avoid any more loss of air power, the Germans considered pulling their fighters out of the Mediterranean. Turning to the battle calculator, they found that their fleet, even with the fighter support, had a less than 4% chance of surviving a fight with the US Navy. This was all they needed to hear, retreating the fighters to Italy. The Germans deployed their build and collected 32 IPCs, 33 with the one left over. Japan needed to strike soon, or Germany wouldn't be playing for much longer. It was business as usual for the British, defending India and attacking France. With 3 tanks headed to India, the UK couldn't build enough units to fill their 3 transports. To make up for this, the forces in Karelia would be transported to Western Europe starting next turn. Sure enough, the British retook France, suffering minimal casualties, but still not matching up to a German counterattack. The British, however, were not concerned. The players for the Western Allies had tweaked the American plans, where France would get reinforced before an assault on Italy. With how many units would be needed to dislodge the Allied forces, Germany wouldn't dare go on the offensive. Where the Allies were still concerned about an attack was Russia, so the British moved their tank in Karelia to that front, just in case. The UK deployed its build, collecting 36 IPCs. The Japanese players saw an opportunity with the now in-range American fleet. While they were aware of the risk, the possibility of wiping out an American fleet was very enticing. Without the threat of American ships or carrier-based fighters, the Japanese could produce transports over support vessels, giving the buildup in Burma a much-needed boost. The Japanese players decided to go for it. Their build this time around would still contain a cruiser, just in case something went wrong. The IJN moved to strike, sending all in-range combat ships into Sea-Zone 49 and sailing their home fleet carrier to the Philippine Islands, where they would launch their fighters into the fight. The IJN's first roll damaged the American battleship and destroyed their auxiliary vessels. The US Navy's first roll, however, dealt a massive blow to the IJN, damaging their battleship, destroying their auxiliary ships, and wiping out an entire carrier force, fighters included. The IJN immediately retreated to Sea-Zone 48, pulling their transports in Sea-Zone 36 back to the Japanese coast and sailing 3 destroyers to the Philippines, protecting what was left of the fleet. The first battle of the game between the IJN and the US Navy was a defeat for the IJN, and a critical one at that. The IJA reinforced its positions in the Soviet Union, but could do nothing about Burma. The Japanese deployed their build and collected 40 IPCs. Had this blunder doomed the Axis? The Americans sure hoped so. Their gamble had paid off even better than expected. The engagement had only cost them a submarine and 2 destroyers. With the IJN in a weakened state, the Americans devoted 20 IPCs to the Pacific, building a battleship for the West Coast. The attack moves this turn would all come against Germany. The bomber targeted the factory, and the American tanks blitzed through South Africa into the Belgian Congo, ending the German presence in Africa. The bomber's luck, however, finally ran out and was shot down. Undeterred, the Americans moved their entire force in and around Morocco into Sea-Zone 14, deploying all the ground units into France. The Western Allies now had a massively fortified territory of their own on mainland Europe. The artillery in the Belgian Congo advanced towards Egypt, ready to aid in the European conquest. In the Pacific, the Americans did not push their luck. Their fleet had achieved what it set out to do, and putting it in further danger was unnecessary. The US Navy grabbed the artillery and retreated back to Hawaii. Whether the 2 fleets would link up or stay as separate forces would be determined next round. The US deployed its build and collected 42 IPCs.
And with that, another 2 rounds has come to an end. The Germans are fighting back in the Western Front, but the Japanese fleet has been crippled. Does this spell certain defeat for the Axis? Find out next Board Game Wednesday. What would you have done in the player's shoes? Let us know down in the comments below, and as always, subscribe to EMFX Studios for more fun, nerdy content.